I'm your host, Ankur, and today I have a very special guest, Niko, the founder of Sparx Insurance. Niko, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Ankur. Very excited to be on.
Yeah, glad to have you on. So, one of the things we love to do on the Pioneers podcast is go through the origin story. So, your founder journey to date. Could you just help us kind of figure out how you got to where you are today?
Yeah. So, quick background for Sparks. My co-founder and I were in the same company two times in a row. We've also known each other for 8 years prior to that. We've been best friends since high school. So, very collaborative over the past decade or so. But when we were at those two companies post grad, we found there was a huge workflow issue around the insurance process for those companies. One was going through a major acquisition. Another one was doing a monster round of funding, around 60 mil. And so we were put in a position where, in our sort of like pseudo chief of staff positions, we went through the process of assessing our companies for insurance needs, trying to understand the more complex landscape around what we were doing there. And we found a lot of the parties we were working with, whether that be the carriers themselves or the insurance brokers, very ancient in how we were working with them. And a lot of them felt like, pseudo car salesmen in how they were pitching things to us, trying to sell us on things, versus analyzing risk and taking us through a process. So that was the first seed of where we started to look at insurance as a problem area that we personally experienced in those two pretty notable milestones in our prior companies. And that's what took us into founding Sparx, and looking at ways to sort of reinvent the insurance world for businesses as they stand now.
Very neat, and I appreciate that breakdown. I think that's interesting to hear, sort of how you got started. And I think insurance, when a lot of people think about it, especially newcomers, they're familiar with insurance in their own personal experiences, so like auto insurance, maybe renters or home insurance. But could you maybe help us take a step back and talk about the different types or categories of insurance that maybe perhaps you as an individual would consider, over the course of your life, versus a business, right? And business insurance is the one that you primarily focus on. So
Yep.
helping us kind of understand a little bit more of what that landscape looks like would be super helpful.
Yeah. So I'll start very broad service level and I'll come into the business insurance vertical. Insurance generally, you can think of as risk transfer. So we come together. This started out with Lloyd's back in I think the 1800s, as you probably know. And it was a group of people coming together to say, hey, instead of each of us being up for grabs on the cost of this potential injury or this potential lawsuit, I'll pay a little bit, you pay a little bit. We all pool our funds. We have this insurance pseudo company entity that comes together. And when something bad happens to one of us out of the 10 of us, money gets paid out for that person. But the rest of us, we know we have peace of mind that if something bad happens to us too, then we have payout as well. So transferring the risk from one individual or entity to a pool of individuals or entities, right? And that's how insurance started. And that's what's brought us to, today. It's the same concept. There's more people in the supply chain. There's all these different types, but at the end of the day, all insurance works towards transferring risk from one to many. When it comes to the different types, there's three categories that you'll commonly come across. One is health insurance, and that you can get from your company or from the government. Then there's life insurance, and that's mostly just private companies. And that, as you know, is just the risk transfer from if you were to pass away or if you were to pass away during a period of time, money is paid out to a beneficiary. And then the third class is around property and casualty insurance. Property being things you own, assets, and casualty being liability. So if something were to happen that you caused, resulting in damages. So that whole class of PNC is where there's a ton of different classes within it. Health and life are pretty self-explanatory. PNC is where you start breaking down between individuals and businesses, and all in between.
Yep.
So a lot of PNC is just the property piece. So you as an individual, you may be renting a house or owning a house. You may own a car or lease a car. You might have fine jewelry. You might have a pet, so anything in between there. That's property on if something were to be damaged, you're purchasing protection on that piece of property. The liability piece is anything in the way of you or an entity is performing an action, and then something can go wrong. So protecting that event in many different ways. And then I'll take that now and I'll narrow it down even further into the business insurance realm. So obviously businesses can own property, but then businesses can, provide services and take action. Um, and that's where we mainly focus is on the business insurance side, where for a lot of our more professional businesses, there's professional lines of a liability risk. So you're doing things like you're selling software. If that software goes belly up and someone was your sales force, the software goes belly up and an entire company was running on your software, that company is going to lose a ton of revenue for X
Mhm.
amount of time until they recover, right? And so you can insure that event so that when that company inevitably sues you because your software failed, you now are protected by the insurance company. So you can see how that starts to shape a ton of different ways. A construction company is building a building. If they never finish the building, property manager is going to want a payout because
Mhm.
they paid X amount up front, right? Or you're taking a client out on a boat and there's something goes wrong on that boat. All these different crazy examples, and we can go into this, but a lot of these different players across the supply chain in insurance, they will go in and focus on a lot of these different niches. And so insurance starts as this big risk transfer and then lowers down into these small niche cases just incredibly across the industry.
That's awesome. I love how you kind of helped us double click really quickly, building
Yeah.
down the foundational piece. And it's great that you described it as risk transfer because that sounds so simple, and
Mm,
ultimately it is. But the space is so complicated, and we'll get to that in a second.
mm,
But insurance isn't something new; it's been around for a very long time. And in fact, before you had formal companies that were selling insurance policies, you would have this in communities, and you still have this in some ways in regional communities and local communities where, for example, a group of villagers might pool together resources, and if someone got injured or lost their job or had a medical situation, the pooled resources would help go and pay for that negative event, right? And ironically, you underwrote who was part of that pool because you knew them, right? So I'm
mm,
sure that if you had a villager, a person in your village that you didn't trust or that was known for having a bad reputation, you wouldn't include them in the pool, right? So again, you kind of denied them the policy issuance, and if they had good character and good reputation, you would include them. So
mm,
again, you were underwriting the policies at the end of the day, and you had some collective risk sharing for negative events. And all of insurance is risk transfer in the event that something negative happens, that you have a payout, right? So it's not a lump sum from a single individual or business. It's coming out from that collective pool. So it helps you kind of survive that potentially catastrophic event if and when it occurs. Um, but unfortunately, it is super complicated. And would love to hear from your perspective, since you're building in that space. What is so broken about insurance? And you may be able to opine in this or not, but how did it get this way?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think you'll have some opinions on this too. So we'll definitely have some back and forth here. But I like to think of it as it's just an old industry, and you can think of a few old industries and how they develop, like the banking infrastructure space. Everything's built on COBOL, and it's been that way for forever, right? And it's tough to break into those pieces of infrastructure and reinvent them without tearing down the sort of institution that's built on top, because it's far easier to just replicate the institution and dress it up a little bit rather than
Mhm.
reinvent the entire piece, so that you can collaborate amongst the entire industry. So what we've seen, in my opinion, having built in the space, insurance is largely very heavily intertwined around the same concept of infrastructure that prevents people from tearing it out and replacing it, which is
Mhm.
again a classic story across a lot of old storied industries.
Mhm.
I mean, the classic examples would be just plain PDFs, which is the most hilarious thing. How have we not changed a PDF process at this point, right? Or even hands-on underwriting. Why do we still have an individual who is, they receive a paper application in their email? We've upgraded from fax to email, which is great. How are they receiving a paper application in the email, reading through a PDF? taking information there, plugging it into algorithms they may or may not have. Some of the underwriting may just be based on my experience. This is, how risky this company is, right? Um, a lot of it just remains a "it's not broke, don't fix it" mentality among the parties that are holding a lot of the risk. So the insurance carriers, and then there's another piece of the supply chain that we won't necessarily have to go into, but the general underwriters or general agents, these groups that are holding the pen in insurance, the ones that actually do the risk assessment, the pricing.
Hmm.
These are groups that it's more profitable to look at different insurance types to create different insurance products, different ways to market them, than to necessarily optimize the back and forth with brokers who are sourcing the business or between different parties within the carrier in assessing the business. So as a result, a lot of it just stays this mesh, this infrastructure that largely doesn't change because we haven't necessarily found a reason to change it until you reach the point where you're interacting with customers, and those customers may want faster service or better
Yep.
ways of interacting with your product. And then on the flip side, the investors who might want different ways to come in and buy out chunks of risk from reinsurance companies and insurance companies. They need to have immediate insight into what these products are, how risky they are, and now we're starting to see more of a need for it. But that's more because of the technology change that is opening up new possibilities, right? That's I've started to see this as essentially, technologies like AI are forcing an industry that has traditionally not changed to change. Whether or not you want to interact with me via
Hmm.
PDF or API, I'm going to force you to be able to interact with me via the fastest way of interacting. And you might not even know that that's what's happening on my end, but that's what we're able to build now, right?
Yep.
So you've seen it, and curious to hear your thoughts too, right? But I've just mainly seen it's an old industry that hasn't had a need to change until it becomes easy enough for it to change, right? Because everything else
Yep.
is a higher priority in some ways, right? So
Yep.
I'm curious, yeah, where have you seen maybe some of the sticking points? Why has this industry not changed? Where have we gone wrong?
Yeah, I think you put this really well, which is that these industries they've been built up over a very long time, decades, right? In some cases, like a century plus. It's the same thing with century-old cities like New York or London or Paris. It's very hard to go and try to say like there's so much about like the New York infrastructure that sucks. Like, how come we can't change it? Yes, you could try to build a modern city from the ground up, and there are cases of that. In Singapore, for example, having been built up in the 1970s and onwards, Dubai, been a very modern city. But more often than not, you're not going to see a city built up from the ground up, right? Most of the time, you're going to have to go upgrade an existing city because there's a lot of great things about it. It serves a critical function, and you have to work within the system to kind of get it to perform better. So I think of insurance and healthcare and even like financial services as these centuries old industries that have ways of doing things. And they do innovate, but that innovation happens in stages and they need a catalyst. And I think of AI as being a very strong forcing function. It's a catalyst that will force the industry to change. Similar to how New York, for example, was built for horses and carriages. And then, at some point it had to be built for cars. And kind of if you fast forward into the future, maybe it's self-driving cars or other types of modes of transportation, and that changes the way that the city operates. Certainly, with bridges and subways also being part of the equation. Similar way insurance is set up today, where a lot of things are very manual because they more or less worked, and you didn't have better ways of operating. So underwriting, one of the most manual processes that exist today. You have humans that ingest documents, basically PDFs, right? They're not facts; they're mostly PDFs are sent over. Even though some of the data is available through APIs, it's still very manual. And then people like humans are going through and classifying the document, finding the different values to pull out, and they pull it out. And then they have some scoring model potentially saying like they have enough income and identity to corroborate. And given that profile, there's a certain level of credit and risk associated with it. And then they go and assign it some risk profile and give it some insurance premium to apply. right? Or they deny the policy. And sometimes it might be that you're missing documents, and so you have a very manual process. People get on the phone or they email asking for missing documents, and so the bad outcomes are the following: it takes days or weeks to get information that you need, to even get a quote, and people get disillusioned, and you end up having cost that's baked in, right? Because the underwriter, someone needs to pay for it. All the administrative costs, someone needs to pay for it. So if you had AI that could make decisions within minutes, you have lower cost, so basically lower premiums. You're able to get basically applicants insurance policies faster, which means they get coverage faster, and it's just a more beautiful, more pleasant experience. So that's kind of the North Star that we've been working through. But often we get asked this from investors is like, how come we don't just do verticalized SaaS, build something from the ground up, build something super modern? And that is a very valid way of building a business. I'm not saying that that isn't, but that's only going to get so much distribution because for every single modern verticalized SaaS player that there is in insurance, for example, there's going to be maybe 5 or 10x as much value from working with the existing players and try to modernize them. And some of that modernization might come from within, but sometimes you need technology vendors like Multimodal to kind of force them in the right direction, be that catalyst for them. So yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of been my take to date, but it is a very frustrating exercise. I don't think it's and I think a lot of people look at it and they're just super frustrated by it, but you do have to play within the rules of the game itself.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So, I mean, one piece that calls out to me there, it's sort of it's again like it feels like the forcing function, right? Like you've said with horse and carriage, right? That to cars, you have to adapt. It's a place where there was no incentive really to stick with the old. There's so much of that in insurance. One piece that I do find very interesting though, one thing you did not mention as a big advantage. So there's the speed, there's the service, right? From the customer standpoint, at least.
Mhm.
One thing you did not mention was the price, which I always think is interesting. The faster we go on many of these things, the more we can perceptually reach a market parity across different carriers.
Yeah.
If you're in a line of insurance where there's more commodity around it. So one good example would be like cyber insurance. That was
Mhm.
probably one of the fastest insurance lines of businesses, where we reached APIs, quick quoting, and market competition in the shortest amount of time. Because a lot of that was popular to write circa 2016, and then you had groups like Coalition who raised $1 billion, literally in venture capital to try and transform spaces like this. Um, so a lot of that ended up being just at market competition. And now you look at
Mhm.
traditional carriers who have been around for 100 plus years. They're real institutions of the economy. They don't want to play those games, and that's one of the pieces of how much can we force a group like this to adapt to our standards now, our new standards of
Yeah.
speed, efficiency, even now price competition. A lot of them, I'm curious to see how they continue to push back on that in different ways, where they say, yeah, it's great. We can underwrite so quickly internally, but we don't want to be able to, put something out so quickly that we're now competing with 7 other carriers within 48 hours to get this company insured. We're just going to end up driving down the price. We don't want to play those games, right?
Yeah.
So that's one big piece of the many advantages that I can only imagine a old storied group would be very interested in, where they start going, oh wow, that's going to kill our business. We can't do that. None of these APIs, none of these quick quotings. That's really just going to drive down price for us, right? So another area where I'm curious to see how much they can potentially hold off there, and who will adapt in interesting ways to get with the times on price at least.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. I think what you're saying, and this makes a lot of sense, that there's internal pressure to not move as quickly in adopting new technology, right? Because the old ways of doing it give you an advantage in the sense that you can charge more, or you kind of retain that monopolistic power that you have in pricing a certain way. And of course, if there's a newcomer that is issuing policies faster and cheaper, because it's able to modernize the entire stack to get that, that will be a forcing function, but until that happens, it's a couple of carriers that have a lot of weight and power. But again, if one of them starts winning a lot of business because they've modernized from within, or they've got vendors to help modernize, it may also force the rest, right? So one of the very interesting applications in insurance that we're delving into is people like businesses and individuals may not know what policies that they should get to cover a certain type of situation that they may have. So they're describing the situation. They're not sure, for example, in business, do you need D&O, do you need cyber, do you need general liability, and if so, what should your limits be or your sublimits be, right? What are the different things you should negotiate? What's standard versus what's not standard? This is ultimately kind of a knowledge transfer problem. There's that knowledge available in the public web. It might even be in the policy docs, but retrieving that information is hard. And so if you could use something like a large language model to go and query that particular context from a carrier and get the answers to the end user faster, they can kind of self-serve themselves in a better way, right? And get to a better policy and have a much more informed decision. And you can imagine this for all sorts of insurance, even in health insurance. We're trying to figure out, do you choose like the different variants and how much do you want out of pocket versus being able to kind of have like lower deductibles, like all the different trade-offs you normally have to go. And you can imagine, like, if you've ever gone shopping for healthcare insurance on anything that resembles marketplace, it's just hard. There's so many options, different carriers, different versions. So information retrieval, better matching, all can be possible with machine learning models. And so the user experience ends up being a whole lot better too. So I'm curious, like, as you're building Sparx, which of these problems do you first identify and solve for? Because I can imagine that there are lots of opportunities within insurance to go and improve things. Which ones are you working on now, and where does that future vision look like in terms of building out Sparx?
Yeah. So, for context, we sit squarely in the brokerage camp, and so the broker in the supply chain. The task really is to make customers happy and interact with the folks who control the insurance products, right? So the carriers who are thinking about how to price the insurance, what to include in the policies, figuring out what's the best combination of that price and coverage, and then conveying that back to the customer. And so you can tell there's, like you mentioned, a lot of knowledge transfer across that supply chain for us. And that's where a lot of our efforts go. So one of the first things we built out internally was a automatic shopping experience for us and our agents, less about showing that to the customer. What we would do is have a universal intake form. We would take the information put in there, and then we would go and ping these either carriers with actual APIs, not many of them that exist, but mostly auto fill out PDF applications and auto send those into to carriers to be able to hit 150 markets versus a traditional broker who's maybe shopping a policy with seven at most. So that was our first piece of tech that we built internally. And what set me off on my bullishness around AI agents, where it's a lot of repetitive tasks. How do you take you can automatically fill in a PDF with input data. That's pretty easy, right? How do you then take that and you go and reach out to each of these contacts at carriers, or go into the portals and physically submit the PDF, or go into the portal and take information and put it into slots in the portal itself, right? So a lot of where people have been focusing on too have been in these realms, but it is at the end of the day very difficult to maintain that across so many different providers, where it made sense actually for us to just build it internally for our use case, for the specific carriers that we like shopping with, essentially. So that was our big first build out, was around building agents to go in and autofill information in portals where you have to log in and go through all these different forms, auto send out PDFs, and then also answer very basic questions from underwriters like, oh, what's the phone number of this customer? They didn't put it in the form. Okay, cool. We can go back and grab that from the our HubSpot instance and send that over to them. Right, small
Yep.
things where we can increase our efficiencies massively, because we're able to take, and it's largely just natural language. Right, we're able to take massive amounts of information and put it into these applications and have these conversations. The other place that we're looking at applying this, like you mentioned, is on the customer facing side, where
Mhm.
insurance feels like a black box in many ways. And a lot of what we've done well is trying to introduce more of that knowledge to our customer, being very transparent on, this is what we did today. Hey, we took your information, we were able to get this many quotes back. These are the conversations we're having. Here's where we're reaching our ending point in finding you the best coverage for your business. So that's where our next set of tools we're looking at building out internally face is making a better customer experience, kind of pairing that with the efficiency gains that we're getting with our internal tools.
Yep.
And you can see, like, I have a lot of conversations with folks up the supply chain on where that takes similar shape, and you can see it everywhere. Not just us as the broker who then go and ping 150 contacts or 150 portals. You then see it where you're a wholesale broker, and you're interacting with another 20 specialized carriers on the back end. You're doing a very similar function to us. So you
Mhm.
need something that is going to take input information and share it out and answer questions across the board that traditionally would take multiple days or weeks, and instead bring that down to hours, or 1 or 2 days, right? And then it goes all the way up to the carrier end where, why ask questions out when you have an LLM that's taking a PDF in and is filling out your input to the algorithm for you, right? And then the underwriter can come in and do the cleanup work. So a lot of it serves itself for automation, and the liability piece, because there's regulation around a lot of this. The liability piece can still be an important part, but doesn't stop us from doing any of this at the end of the day. So something where a lot of what we see again is just moving knowledge around, in the most efficient way. I see that getting very quickly adopted as groups like a multimodal come in and make it possible for someone to, at these large old carriers, take information in quickly, move it around correctly, and
Yep.
accurately. So that's where we see. That's where I at least see a lot of the future going in the insurance space.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much a shared mission because I think what you've done is you're building from within the system, right? So there's a lot that you're automating internally, which means you could go deliver better results to your customers because you're shopping basically the ask to many other downstream players. And then you're able to kind of make that process faster because you've built out the automation on your side. And whatever is not automated, you could still kind of fill the void by having just really good customer service on your side, right? So, and I've seen this firsthand because I think candidly, like we've gotten insurance directly with you, right? So you've gotten placed that placed a couple of insurance policies now, and the customer experience is great because I'm able to articulate what our needs are, and you have context around the company, and then you're able to go and get and shop it around, and then find the best deal, and then kind of bring that to the table. And you're able to do that with a small team because you've automated so much of what you've already, what you need to do. And the challenge is what you said, which is it's about speaking to different systems in the various formats that they need to operate in. Sometimes it is filling out forms or submitting PDFs and doing questionnaires. And what we try to do for our customers is very much that is we go and remove the people tasks from the equation because it's about taking information in one format and then pushing that downstream. And that means interacting and basically engaging with a couple of downstream systems. But once you have your information flowing across all those systems, what used to take, like, I would say 100 keystrokes or 100 mouse clicks might just take two or three. Now all of a sudden you could move a whole lot faster. There might be still some people part of what you do, but it becomes a small fraction versus the very, very manual and like very fragmented, very broken process that it is today.
Yeah, 100%. That's where, like, again, most of the opportunity is low hanging fruit in a way where it's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of just moving knowledge around. And this, with AI specifically in just natural language, which there's so many technologies coming out now, around image processing that can also transform the underwriting process or ways of intaking data. But just at the basic level of, like you said, keystrokes and mouse clicks, we're getting so good at that it's inevitable that those parts of the process get automated out, and
Yep.
then we can focus on even the higher tier problems of, how do we intake mass amounts of risk data to be able to provide better models on the carrier side, right? Or even us
Yep.
at the brokerage level, how can we, like we've been saying, interact with customers in a far new experience so that everything's very clear. We're analyzing risk for their business and transferring that knowledge correctly to the carrier as well. So it's at the basic level of, I love that, keystrokes and mouse clicks that we're going to remove that first, and it should be coming like a freight train, right? Very,
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
quickly, ideally over the next year or so, right?
Yeah, and that's a low-hanging fruit. Replace keystrokes and mouse clicks. The next bit is there's probably context about the business or the individual that you're not capturing, because the traditional ways of modeling that is just hard. So like, I'll just give you an example. If you had more context about my history as a founder or the business that we're in and how we're going to market and the traction that we've had, maybe some of that can't be quantified through just numerical data, right? So you could look at our bank statements, you could look at our revenue on Stripe or whatever it might be, and that will give you some picture. But you're going to miss a lot of additional context that might be more natural language in nature, and that is a part of risk that you're not identifying and capturing and accommodating. And if you could incorporate that into the risk modeling, you'll actually be able to underwrite more intelligently. Right. And so now all of a sudden your risk model can evolve and be more inclusive of data that it should actually have, and so you're making better policy decisions like that. That's like a future like state that we could achieve. But for now, you don't necessarily even need to talk about all the new features and capabilities that AI can deliver. It's great that if you are and you're building there, but you don't have to start with that. You don't have to go imagine something that's so far forward into the future. You could actually just automate what you have today as you operate with your business, right? And the way I've often started to describe it is that you're introducing calculators to people that were doing long form math, right? So you're still doing math. It's the same thing. You'll still get to the same end state. You'll just be more efficient at doing that. So I'm curious, like now that you've been building in this space, um, how do you evangelize like the journey you're on, the journey that multimodal is on, right? Like we have a shared mission. How have you thought about evangelizing that to people that are maybe more traditional in nature, maybe not as familiar with like APIs or with large language models? How have you been able to describe basically adopting this new technology in the areas that they operate in?
Yeah, it's a great question. One part of it, like I mentioned very early on in our conversation, one part of it is just forcing them to take it, right? Which is purely on the idea that if you're only going to take a PDF, you don't know what an API is, which is a crazy thing in 2024. I'm going to fill out your PDF with an AI agent, and it's going to be as if I'm using an API, and that's fine with me, right? You will never know that on my end, I'm automating a process. You will just receive the PDF in your email and you'll be happy, right? Or you'll receive all the information formatted correctly in your portal and you'll be happy, right? So forcing folks to adopt these technologies without even knowing they are, because we're inventing all these different ways of interacting with different interfaces that it'll take a long time for those to change, and we can force them to change now in the today, right? When it comes to evangelizing directly, I mean, one great example, we're part of an insurtech coalition with
Mm-hmm.
some of the big companies like Coalition, like Root. So a lot of these publicly traded insurtechs who have internally adopted a lot of this new technology.
Yeah.
And so we get to see a lot of it in the way of lobbying, working with these old story carriers and bringing them to the table with essentially it feels like the kids, right? A lot of these companies that have been around for only anywhere from 8 to 10 years at the most, but have gone public, have definitely had their hit in the public markets, but have shown that they can stick around and make real change in the market, right? So showing by doing in a lot of ways, from at least the colleagues that we interact with.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other place that we see it a lot, we regularly get outreach from innovation groups at some of the carriers, but a lot of the folks in the middle of the supply chain. So that may be a fronting carrier, a managing general agent, or a managing general underwriter. So groups where they're leaner and there's still folks who are very traditional in insurance, but they're looking to take on new technologies, new ways of operating. So we work a lot with those groups who are just looking at being the new people on the block.
Yeah.
So that's where we see a lot of the movement happening, is actually folks now reaching out and looking for ideal use cases within their companies, and just seeing that we are a fast moving technology company ourselves within the space. So that's where it's an exciting moment to see that there's so much use case being created that people are reaching for it and looking for ways to bring it internally. And then the classic conferences. If one were to want to really dive into this, the insurance conferences are actually really great. I know some industries they're just a party. In
Yeah.
insurance, it's actually very intellectual folks who are digging into this industry, and then they have fun on the side as well, right? But
Yeah.
the conferences are some of the most stimulating places where new vendors come in and are trying to make active change in a very storied industry, and that's always exciting to see.
Yep. Yep. I think there's a lot of knowledge transfer that happens in person, right? And then
Mm.
also through the small insider groups that exist. So I think that's really awesome. So I think one of the things that I think like the mainstream population is really worried about, and I empathize with them, is what are some of the risks and ethical considerations of having technology like AI make more of the decisions that impact our financial lives, and that could be financial or even maybe more than just financial, right? When it comes to like health insurance or life insurance policies. So, how do you think about the risks of potentially giving AI the agency to make the final call on which policies get underwritten at what risk, what premiums and such, right? So it affects pricing. Do we provide that agency to AI, or do we always go and have humans review it? I'm curious what your stance is on that.
There's Yeah, it's so interesting. There's so many different ways this can go. I mean, I could easily say if an AI agent had knowledge that it was just incorrect information, they filled out an application for just more boring standard business insurance. We hopefully get that approved by the customer. The carrier may catch any errors, but let's say everything goes past it. Coverage could be canceled, and a company could be liable for a $2 million lawsuit, and then they're out of business, right? Like lives get essentially destroyed because an AI wasn't the most accurate in the information it was giving, and that's to me like the lowest level of morality, regulatory risk, everything there, because that's just standard contracts. You mess up a contract, it goes away, and
Yeah.
you're left without coverage, right? This not necessarily scarier, but the more interesting bits come in around the individual. So health insurance is a great example where you're having a conversation with an AI. It's analyzing your voice. It can tell you have depression, which has been proven. There's studies now where models can diagnose depression or anxiety, and you don't even know if you have it really, right?
Hmm.
So let's say you're applying for life insurance or health insurance, and the AI has now produced a whole new parameter to assess what your pricing is or if you should even be covered. And now you're allowing a machine to tell you that your rate is going to go up 10x next year because
Yeah.
you're at a higher risk for a lot of these different diseases, right? Because it can just sense it via again data that we didn't have previously. That is a crazy thought because now you can also start introducing AI bias. People who are actually training these AIs, okay, whose voices are they using in order to create these algorithms that may try and detect depression and anxiety? Are they skewed towards some minority groups versus others? And so you may see minority populations who are getting higher priced insurance because that's just the data sets we have, or that's the bias in the creators of these algorithms. And you see Caucasian individuals who are going by with lower prices, right? Not saying that's where the bias necessarily sits is racially, but we've seen it as well, right? There's classic studies on AI currently where the people who are making these algorithms or these training data sets are not necessarily representative of the entire population, right? So
Sure.
putting us
Yeah.
in a position where we are opening up risk for bias within the algorithm that can directly affect someone's life. If you can't get the life insurance or you can't get health insurance because of a pre-existing condition that you didn't know about and only AI created for you, you're now at a huge disadvantage in society. Like these are essential pieces to have. You need car insurance to be able to drive. You need health insurance to be able to live. You're now giving up a lot more of that data into a black box that you don't know where it's necessarily coming out of. Right? Those are two, in my opinion, very pertinent examples where we go from the more boring, just standard use cases to a place where we're now opening ourselves up to just systemic risk around individuals. That's where of the sort of anti AI safety that I see, in a lot of different use cases. This is one where it's just something that directly impacts someone, right? And
Sure.
is definitely warranting more investigation, more research, more discussion around a lot of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because I think humans can also make poor decisions. Like they have a bias or they missed something, but that mistake, let's say it's mistake as opposed to like overt bias. If they make a mistake, it's stemmed to it's kind of contained, right? It's like that one individual may be affecting dozens or hundreds of policies. When an AI goes wrong, particularly if it's applied at scale, it could affect hundreds of thousands or millions of policies. So it's the scale factor. It's just the same thing with social, right? Like you have one or two bad actors, individuals that are doing something on social. Yes, that's bad, and but it's contained because there's only so much reach that a single individual may get. It depends on the individual. But if AI is behaving that way and has dozens and dozens or hundreds of accounts and spreading misinformation, the impact is so much greater. So AI is able to scale something so that bias or that mistake can get scaled in a way that could be very, very detrimental. At the same time, even if AI is able to make really great decisions, like better decisions, because it's able to detect things like depression, trust in AI is going to be really critical. So the ability for AI to explain how it got to a certain decision and providing that visibility to people that need that need that intel to regulate, for example, that's going to be critical. And I think it's going to take time for us to build that trust in AI. I mean, I saw this 7 years ago when I was designing anti-money laundering software for the world's largest banks, and they basically have to tell their central bank in their country why they investigated certain cases over others. And if they couldn't explain it, and there was an incident of money laundering that was failed to like someone failed to look at it, they would be penalized severely for that, right? Unless they had a good reason for not looking at it. So um, even then, like the AI would need to provide some interpretation as to why a case should be flagged or not flagged. And I think we're at that same juncture for insurance and for healthcare today. So it'll be interesting to see sort of how that plays out. Um, so a couple of questions now that we're getting to the tail end of our conversation. Which insure tech companies do you admire that have done a really great job of taking an emerging technology and applying it? And what are some things that we could learn from them?
Yeah, I think the one that I admire the most, not to pick my favorite child, but Coalition was probably the best example that we saw in the market. Because a lot of what InsurTech was from 2015 to 2020 was big, fancy venture capital, a lot of quick growth, a lot of subsidization. And what we find is that insurance at its core, and we've been saying this, insurance at its core is a long-term game and it's a long storied industry. So you can only change it so much, but you have to operate within the bounds of what's kept the 100-plus-year-old carriers alive, and sort of replicate a lot of what you see there, just with the dressings up of better technology, better service, better underwriting, right? So what we saw with a group like Coalition, they came to the cyber market. They came in with technology first, but the insurance was the piece that made them different, yet the same in so many ways. So I'll break it down to a specific example. One big risk in cyber underwriting was that if someone was hacked, you wouldn't necessarily be able to predict their likelihood of being hacked. And obviously, if they're hacked and money is stolen or systems shut down and you lose revenue,
Mm-hmm.
you have to pay out as the carrier, right? So a lot of folks would just carve out majority of hacking. And what Coalition did was come to market with free security software. And so they would implement multi-factor authentication, a very
Mm-hmm.
basic security measure that a lot of traditional tech companies will use. But majority of SMBs might not even know what that is, right? So they came to market with very standard email storage security software for free, and so they would onboard a company onto that, and that was a big differentiator. Was they were able to protect companies with the software, and then they would underwrite in a more traditional insurance sense, right?
Yeah.
And so they would, they wouldn't price crazily low. They would price on what they knew to happen with their software. They knew folks would not get hacked. And so they knew they could, provide slightly lower prices in the market and stay
Yeah.
a long-term player, right? And that's what led to them raising $1 billion, and, continually growing now as a storied influence in the cyber insurance space. So something where they were technology first, they didn't reinvent the insurance part. They made it mold to what they wanted to see the future of insurance to be, right? Lower prices,
Yeah.
faster quoting, better quality experience, And technology is what fueled that. And so learning from them, we can see now where why didn't a traditional carrier say, here's my software, it's free, right? You use this and I'm going to cut the risk of your business, right? We're now in a place where AI is that on steroids, right? Now you can have an AI chatbot. Everyone has one. It's becoming this like table stakes
Yeah.
where it's so easy to implement. You need to have it to compete with other folks. We're going to just see those use cases continually crop up where you'll see the coalitions of the world, either new entrants coming in with the best experience all around, containing this more traditional insurance piece of their business, or traditional carriers who are going to come in and just transform how they're interacting with the consumers in the space. And so I think a lot of what we're learning from coalition is largely around that, and more so optimizing the insurance side, but keeping it traditional where it needs to stay traditional.
Yep. Yeah, that's incredible. Like they work from within, right? So they weren't trying to gut and replace the entire system, which typically doesn't work that well. But they changed user behavior to some extent by having MFA, right? They understood that these were companies that likely had lower risk profiles, given some of the things that they were adopting and being forced upon to some extent. And then they built a really great business. Again, not doing anything that was like dramatically different, still within the confines of the industry, but nudging and shaping behavior, I think, helped them build a really successful business. And I think that's right. I think there are two ways to go about it. You can try to disrupt the entire system, and sometimes that works well. It's a little bit harder, but when it works well, it's like a mega opportunity, or maybe a more risk assessed or risk adjusted bet that might make more sense is try to work within, try to find the different areas to innovate and innovate within that. And that might be enough to go and build a really successful business. And this is, I think, really relevant for founders, but then also operators are trying to figure out what use cases of AI to do within their organization, regardless of the size. And then certainly for investors who are looking at the broader space. So yeah, very interesting conversation. One final bit. I'm very curious what you think about very large enterprise companies in insurance. Will they be able to innovate from within, or will the forcing function be primarily insure tech, startups that are up and coming that will really force them to change their behavior?
Yeah, with interest of time, I'll keep this one short. But I think the ideal for a large enterprise in insurance will be to take on the technologies that will innovate on everything around their core first. So making things that make customers happier and more efficient, making the underwriting process more efficient as well. But like we had mentioned earlier, not necessarily touching the last bits of the industry that keep them relevant. So if you want to be the best
Yeah,
insurer within a specific niche, you may not want to move the fastest when it comes to your policies. You may just want to be able to have the best coverage, but it's a pretty good price point. It's not the best price point. Something where you don't want to be able to hit immediate dopamine, immediate market competition. So touching areas where it makes the most sense and is probably the lowest hanging fruit first, instead of digging deep into their spaces. But ultimately, I see startups coming in to revolutionize the software stacks, not necessarily the core insurance piece. And that's where
yeah.
the carriers who've been around for 100 years will be around for another 100 years, and it'll be very tough to upend them. And instead, working with them will be the best place for a lot of these startups.
That's awesome advice. Well, Niko, it's been a pleasure having you on the podcast. Where can people find more about you or Sparx? We'll make sure to leave that in the show notes.
Great. Yeah. So people can find us on our website, use Sparx, and that's Sparx spelled Sparx. And you can check out all of our case studies and different ways that we operate in the insurance space. And feel free to reach out with any questions or interests.
Awesome. Thanks, Niko. Appreciate you having you on the podcast.
Cool. Thanks so much.